Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at the impacts of war and conflict. There is a positive correlation between underdevelopment and the incidences of war and conflict, with many of the poorest nations in the world having been involved in either internal conflict or wars with other nations. Whilst it's easy to measure the economic effect of war and conflict on development, there are also social costs which inhibit a nation in its attempts to develop in the post-conflict years, with many nations slipping back into conflict as a result. Conflict within a nation does not only impact on the nations involved, with environmental damage and strained international relations, just two of the global impacts of conflict in the developing world. Looking at the types of conflict in the developing world, conflicts in the developing world are often civil conflicts, contained within a nation and based upon identity politics or clashes of ideologies between groups, rather than full-scale mass warfare, but this does not make them any less devastating. Conflict can arise through insurgency against the government in power, or even through a nation's leadership targeting specific groups within society, examples of which include Syria and Myanmar. Further conflicts sparked over control of resources, as was the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with valuable minerals and metals being controlled by militias in exchange for arms with organised crime syndicates, mostly based in Eastern European nations. Mary Kaldor identified these types of conflict as new wars, as opposed to the types of warfare seen with Western nations. For example, the war on terror that led to the invasion of both Iraq and Afghanistan, or the current conflict in Ukraine. These are old wars, reliant upon the mass mobilization of resources by nation states. Collier argued that war and conflict causes massive economic damage for nations in the developing world, finding that the poorest nations in the world had been involved in conflict in recent years. For example, nations marred by conflict in recent years, such as South Sudan, Yemen and the Democratic Republic of Congo, are amongst the lowest ranking nations for GDP per capita. Collier argued that economic instability in a nation can place strain on elected officials and lead to them falling into the coup trap, whereby a government is overthrown, more often by military powers. For example, in both Argentina and Chile in the 1970s, elected governments were overthrown by military coups. Furthermore, economic strain is worsened by conflict as nations face economic sanctions, the severing of trade links, lack of production, the destruction of transport infrastructures, and in the process of rebuilding, often a reliance upon Western aid in order to rebuild, which generates debt. Furthermore, military aid that is given in times of conflict often has to be repaid, which will generate further debt. There is also lasting damage to the social infrastructure of nations. Education is severely disrupted, with damage to schools being one aspect of conflict. Furthermore, there are conflicting ideologies about the purpose of education, with some groups such as Boko Haram opposing the westernized education that is provided, particularly to girls, in regions of the developing world. Furthermore, children's education is disrupted through the use of child soldiers in some conflicts. UNICEF reports that between 2005 and 2020, over 90,000 children were verified to have been recruited into armed militias and served in combat. Damage to the infrastructure of nations also causes social damage, with hospitals, transport links and places of worship often targeted in conflicts with the purpose of causing disruption. And of course, the loss of life and disruption to communities can damage nations, with the aftermath of conflict being just as devastating through the spread of disease and worsening living conditions as a result of the ongoing conflicts in the developing world. Perhaps a lesser known impact of war and conflict is the damage to the environment. With the use of heavy artillery such as tanks and the use of explosive munitions such as landmines and mortars, many areas of a nation are destroyed. Even unspent munitions can have long-lasting effects. impacting on the ability of the nation to use land for livestock or farming. Conflict can also generate mass pollution of both air and water, while the movement of large numbers of refugees generates both economic and environmental problems, as the infrastructure of nations struggle to cope with rapid increases to the population. Finally, the impacts of war and conflict are also felt on the international community. In some areas of the developing world, countries that border nations in conflict can be impacted. In terms of refugee settlements and the loss of trade, particularly if those nations are landlocked and are reliant upon other nations for access to ports. The loss of suppliers can also impact on other nations. It's estimated that the current conflict in Ukraine will impact on the production of bread in countries nearby that are reliant upon Ukrainian wheat, such as Egypt and Yemen. Despite this, there seems to be little intervention from Western nations in trying to restore order. Many see forcibly restoring peace to the nations as futile, as further conflicts are likely to arise if the conflict is not resolved. Others argue that many nations see conflict as an opportunity to modernise. Critics such as dependency theorists argue that the use of disaster capitalism has profited many transnational corporations who will benefit from rebuilding nations after conflict, including the economic and social infrastructure, through the use of lucrative aid contracts awarded by Western international governmental organisations to redevelop nations. An example of this was the use of Western transnational corporations in rebuilding Iraq following the invasion in 2003. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at global development, focusing on the impacts of war and conflict. Thanks for watching.